Judge Judy explodes on live TV, Jasmine Crockett's chilling response stuns the nation and goes viral. Judge Judy's voice thundered through the CNN town hall studio. "You have no idea what you're talking about." She snapped, her finger pointed squarely at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The cameras were rolling, the audience silent, and the confrontation that was supposed to be a civil discussion on criminal justice reform had just detonated into the most electrifying moment of live television in years. Across from her sat the poised figure of Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, her hands resting calmly on the table. What unfolded in the next few minutes would not only silence one of the most iconic figures in televised law, but ignite a global media storm, define the generational divide in American justice, and propel a rising political star into the national spotlight. The program began like any other televised policy forum. CNN's Anderson Cooper, known for his steady moderation, introduced both guests with formality and respect. On one side, Judge Judy Sheindlin, 81 years old, former family court judge and decades-long TV personality, hailed as a symbol of law and order jurisprudence. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, 43, a freshman congresswoman from Texas with a sharp legal mind and a reputation for fearless advocacy on civil rights and justice reform. The early exchanges were measured. Both women presented their viewpoints on sentencing reform, policing, and recidivism. But tensions mounted quickly when Crockett turned the conversation toward data. "We have a two-tier justice system," she stated, "where a young black man with a small amount of marijuana is sentenced to years in prison, while a wealthy white defendant walks with probation for far more serious offenses." Judge Judy's expression darkened. Her fingertips tapped against the desk, a familiar signal to viewers of her long-running television show that a sharp retort was brewing. "Excuse me," she cut in sharply. "Racist foundations, I've spent over 30 years in courtrooms. Justice is blind. It doesn't see color. It sees behavior." Crockett remained unmoved. With respect, she replied, "The data says otherwise. Black defendants receive sentences on average 19% longer than their white counterparts for the same crimes. That's not speculation. That's the Department of Justice." The audience stirred. Anderson Cooper shifted in his seat. Judge Judy leaned forward, her voice rising. "Statistics can be twisted. What I saw were people making choices, good or bad. That's not racism. That's personal responsibility." Crockett didn't flinch. Her tone was calm, but her words cut clean. "I'm not excusing behavior, Judge. I'm asking why that same behavior is punished so differently depending on race or zip code." And then, in a moment that would later define the entire event, Judge Judy abandoned debate and turned to personal critique. "Your generation," she said, voice laced with disdain, "wants to blame the system instead of holding people accountable. That's not justice. That's social work." Crockett's body language shifted slightly. No outrage, no defensiveness, just an almost imperceptible adjustment in posture. "Judge Sheindlin," she began, now using the formal honorific with precision, "in all your years on the bench, did you ever stop to ask why certain communities kept appearing in your courtroom more than others?" A silence fell over the studio. The live audience waited. Judge Judy answered without hesitation. "Because those communities have more crime." And that's when Crockett took control. She leaned in slightly, her voice low, but unmistakably firm. "That answer is exactly why we need criminal justice reform. Because it assumes the problem is the people, not the policy. The presence of police increases arrests. Mandatory minimums, you support targeted drugs used predominantly in black communities with harsher penalties than those used in white ones. That's not equal justice. That's institutional bias." Judge Judy attempted to interject, but Crockett calmly raised her hand. "If I may finish," she said, resuming with quiet authority. "You've mentioned experience. Let me tell you about mine. I spent years in courtrooms defending clients who got decades for nonviolent offenses. I've watched sentencing disparities tear families apart. And yes, I've only been in Congress for a short time, but before that, I fought for justice case by case." Crockett's words had shifted the room. Anderson Cooper watched with widened eyes. The audience had gone from murmurs to complete stillness. "The difference between us," Crockett continued, "isn't just years. It's perspective. You saw defendants as cases. I saw them as people, human beings crushed by a system that was never designed to treat them fairly." She paused, not for effect, but because the truth needed space to breathe. "And since we're on the subject of manipulated statistics, let me offer some that speak for themselves. The United States has 5% of the world's population, yet holds 25% of the world's prisoners. Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of whites, despite using drugs at similar rates." Judge Judy sat back in her chair. Her signature glare was gone, replaced by silence. Crockett's voice softened, but the precision remained. Those aren't just numbers, they're lives, they're stories, and they're consequences of policies we still defend under the guise of fairness. The moment had turned. What began as an attack had transformed into an indictment not of one person, but of a way of thinking. And Crockett wasn't finished. You've built a legacy on televised justice, but justice isn't performance. It isn't raised voices and clever quips. It's about truth, fairness, and accountability, not just for the accused, but for the systems that judge them. As the first part of this broadcast draws to a close, the energy in the room had irrevocably shifted. What began as an outburst had become an exposure. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout. She dismantled quietly, thoroughly, and in real time. Her calm never wavered, her logic never bent. And as millions continued watching, the next segment would only deepen the reckoning that had just begun. By the time the cameras resumed, the energy inside the CNN studio was unrecognizable from when the program had started. The audience, once split between admiration for a courtroom icon and curiosity about a rising political voice, now leaned forward, not for drama, but clarity. Judge Judy Long, known for commanding any room she entered, sat noticeably more still, her hands folded, her gaze unsettled. Anderson Cooper attempted to pivot. "Let's move the conversation forward," he said, his tone carefully neutral to how we ensure fairness in the application of the law. But the damage had already been done. Crockett had not just questioned Judge Judy's framing, she had exposed its foundations. And now, the conversation had shifted from policies to principles. Jasmine Crockett resumed her remarks with surgical calm. "Let's talk about accountability," she said, eyes focused ahead. "You say my generation doesn't take responsibility. But I ask, who built the system we're supposed to be accountable to?" There was no dramatic music, no interruption, just quiet that made every word hit harder. Communities didn't choose redlining. They didn't choose underfunded schools or housing discrimination or unequal sentencing. But they live with the consequences. And when we name those truths, we're not shifting blame. We're lifting the burden of silence. The studio remained hushed. Even Judge Judy, who had never been one to cede the spotlight, stayed silent. Crockett pressed forward. "You said earlier that you've seen all kinds of people in your courtroom. That justice is about behavior, not color. But let's be honest, when certain communities are policed more aggressively, they are arrested more frequently. When the law sets harsher penalties for the drugs associated with one race versus another, justice becomes conditional." She paused. "That's not justice. That's architecture." Judge Judy finally spoke, but her voice had softened. "I worked hard to treat everyone equally," she said. "I made decisions based on facts, not feelings." "No doubt," Crockett replied respectfully. "But even facts can be filtered through a system built on inequity. It's not about your intentions, it's about the outcomes." And that was the heart of the argument. For decades, Judge Judy represented an approach to justice rooted in personal accountability, deterrence, and visible authority. But Crockett, trained in both law and lived experience, exposed the blind spots in that philosophy, not with anger, but with evidence. Then came the moment that shifted the entire national conversation. With calm precision, Crockett looked directly at Judge Judy and said, "You've called me inexperienced, said I've only been in Congress for 5 minutes. That may be true, but I've spent a lifetime in courtrooms defending people who never got a second chance. I've faced judges who looked through my clients like they were already guilty." She leaned forward slightly. "And I've never forgotten what that felt like to stand in front of power and know that truth might not be enough." Judge Judy said nothing. The tension in the studio was no longer combative, it was reflective. For the first time, she seemed to be listening, not to respond, but to reckon. Crockett continued, her voice now tinged with something deeper than debate memory. "I remember a case where a black teenager was sentenced to 15 years for armed robbery. That same week, a white teenager with a similar charge got 3 years and probation. Same age, same charge, same judge. The difference, zip code, legal representation, race. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. That's not theory. That's my career." Anderson Cooper, visibly moved, tried to navigate the moment. "Congresswoman Crockett, some will say, your views challenge long-held beliefs about justice and equality. What do you say to them?" Crockett looked into the camera, her answer already prepared. "I don't ask people to abandon what they believe. I ask them to look closer at what's actually happening. The question isn't whether justice is blind. It's whether we're brave enough to open our eyes." It was this framing, non-confrontational but uncompromising, that turned Crockett's performance into more than just a political statement. It became a teachable moment. The second phase of the broadcast had revealed the deeper contrast between the two women, not temperament, not career length, but philosophy. one rooted in the courtroom as punishment, the other in the courtroom as battleground for human dignity. As the camera zoomed in on Judge Judy, she looked not furious but contemplative. Meanwhile, Crockett had become something else entirely, no longer just a guest, no longer even a politician. She had become the voice of a generation that no longer asked for permission to speak, but demanded to be heard with facts, experience, and unshakable calm. The segment break came and went, but the dynamic inside the studio had fundamentally changed. No longer a battleground between two towering personalities, the conversation now unfolded like a slow, relentless tide, moving away from drama towards something resembling collective reckoning. On social media, the moment was already exploding. But inside CNN's town hall, the weight of what had been said lingered in the air like the echo of a gavel that never had to fall. Anderson Cooper attempted once more to reset the tone. Let's turn now to media and the role of public perception in shaping trust in the justice system, he said, though everyone in the room knew that wasn't the real story anymore. The real story had already happened. This was the aftermath. Jasmine Crockett addressed the shift head-on. Perception is shaped by who controls the narrative, she said. And for too long, our media has portrayed justice as a spectacle, rather than a system where rage equals truth and calm equals weakness. There was no mistaking her subtext. Judge Judy, the face of televised adjudication for decades, had built her career on authority through volume. Crockett was now redefining that image, offering a counter-narrative where control, not confrontation, held the power. And then, with devastating clarity, Crockett turned directly to her opponent, Judge Shindlin. She said the name precise, formal, respectful, but firm. You've presided over thousands of cases. You've delivered verdicts in a studio for millions to watch. But I need to ask you, do you believe those cases represented justice or ratings? A ripple moved through the audience. The question unspoken until now was finally on the table. Judge Judy paused, visibly shaken for the first time. My show brought real cases into the public eye, she answered, and my record as a real judge speaks for itself. Crockett nodded. I don't question that. But what I question is the message those performances sent. That courtroom power looks like sarcasm. That dignity means being dismissed with a catchphrase. That if you're poor, angry, or unfamiliar with the law, you deserve to be publicly humiliated. That's not justice. That's theater. The comment didn't just challenge a career, it challenged a generation's understanding of televised accountability. And it hit its target. Judge Judy's hands clasped tightly in her lap. She offered no rebuttal. For the first time in the program, the balance of power had fully inverted, and everyone watching could feel it. Then came the line that would define the moment on every platform. You asked earlier what my problem is, Crockett said, standing slowly, her voice still even. It's not with accountability. It's with hypocrisy, not with law, but with those who profit from injustice and then lecture others on responsibility. The room fell completely silent. You made a career being tough, but being tough on people who can't fight back isn't courage. It's cruelty. And I don't get intimidated by cruelty. I confront it. From the back rows, someone audibly whispered, "Wow." Anderson Cooper didn't speak. He didn't need to. The exchange, lasting less than 20 minutes in real time, had shifted from policy to ethics, from debate to dismantling, from legacy to mirror. Jasmine Crockett had come onto the stage as a civil rights lawyer turned congresswoman unknown to much of the mainstream viewing public. Now she stood not taller in stature, but heavier in meaning. She had become the face of a generational shift, not just in ideology, but in conduct. She didn't outshout her opponent. She out-anchored her. She turned the accusation of inexperience into a case study in composure. Backstage aides scrambled to respond. The control room replayed key segments in slow motion, stunned at the clarity with which Crockett had reversed the entire narrative arc of the broadcast. And at the center of it all stood a woman who had never raised her voice, but had raised a standard for what debate should look like, for how injustice should be confronted, and for what real leadership under pressure truly means. The town hall was not yet over. But for millions watching live, and tens of millions more, who would watch the replays, Jasmine Crockett had already delivered the closing argument of the night. In the hours that followed, the broadcast footage moved at the speed of light across social platforms. But inside the studio, the atmosphere remained hushed. Judge Judy, who had once silenced courtrooms with a glance, now sat quietly, her once commanding posture diminished by the weight of what had transpired. There was no collapse, no concession, just the reality of a power dynamic that had been unmistakably rewritten, without shouting, without spectacle, without personal attack. Anderson Cooper, with practiced professionalism, finally re-entered the moment. Congresswoman Crockett, he asked gently, How do you think this conversation reflects the broader debate happening across America about generational change in leadership? Crockett didn't hesitate. This isn't just generational, she said. It's cultural. It's about how we define strength. For too long, we've mistaken volume for clarity, punishment for justice, and tradition for truth. But strength can be silent. Justice can be calm. And clarity, it doesn't need to yell. The audience didn't applaud. They absorbed. And when we talk about leadership, she added, it shouldn't be about how long you've held a title. It should be about what you do. When the lights are on, the pressure is high, and the easy thing to do is respond with anger, because anyone can perform power. But real power, it holds. The quiet confidence in her tone made the words land with surgical precision. Crockett wasn't arguing anymore. She was setting a standard. And that standard was already reverberating far beyond the studio. Within 24 hours, clips of the exchange had been viewed over 50 million times across platforms. TikTok accounts created on the same day amassed hundreds of thousands of followers. Twitter was flooded with reactions from law professors and students to activists and political pundits. A tweet from legal analyst at the Legal Eagle went viral. I've practiced law for 15 years. Crockett didn't just win a debate. She dismantled a doctrine. She made courtroom tactics look like public service. Political figures quickly joined the wave. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what happens when you prepare with facts, speak with purpose, and never let intimidation define the moment." Jasmine Crockett showed exactly why this next generation is ready. Even moderate voices like Senator Joe Manchin, usually cautious in praise, issued a rare statement. Disagree or agree with her politics. What Crockett displayed tonight was real leadership. Calm under pressure, poise under attack, facts under fire. Newsrooms scrambled to analyze what they'd witnessed. CNN's own post-event panel called the exchange a masterclass in composure and rhetorical precision. The New York Times ran a headline, "How Jasmine Crockett Rewrote the Rules of Political Debate Without Ever Raising Her Voice." The Washington Post declared, "In a town hall built for drama, Crockett delivered discipline. But while media raced to contextualize the moment, Crockett herself stayed silent. No victory lap. No press tour. She quietly returned to her duties on the Hill, her work speaking louder than any soundbite. Back in the studio, the town hall technically continued. Questions from the audience resumed, but even Judge Judy's responses came now with a tempered tone. Not retreat, but reconsideration. Her voice didn't boom. Her words didn't cut. And perhaps that was the most telling outcome of all. The confrontation had not created chaos. It had created contemplation. And as the final question was asked and the town hall drew to its scheduled close, Anderson Cooper offered a parting thought, unscripted and uncharacteristically personal. Whatever side of this issue you fall on, he said, tonight we witnessed not just a debate, but a dialogue, one that challenged assumptions, forced reflection, and reminded us what real discourse under pressure can look like. As the cameras faded to black and the credits began to roll, Jasmine Crockett remained seated calmly organizing her papers. Judge Judy stood, slowly shook her hand briefly and turned away, not defeated, but changed. And in the minds of millions watching around the world, a single truth was undeniable. This was more than a town hall. It was a transformation. As dawn broke the following morning, the impact of the town hall had already crystallized into something more than trending hashtags or viral clips. Across the political spectrum, commentators, legal scholars, educators, and voters were no longer talking about who had won the debate. They were talking about what the debate meant. Universities quickly began integrating segments of the exchange into law and communication curricula. Harvard Law School released a faculty blog post titled "The Crockett Framework, Calm, Clear, and Constitutionally Grounded," analyzing how legal training had translated into public discourse more effectively than years of televised courtroom monologues. Civic teachers nationwide introduced the video into civics and government classes. It wasn't the theatrics they highlighted, it was the balance, the restraint, the rare mastery of message over emotion. Students who had grown up with courtroom television suddenly found themselves questioning the difference between entertainment and advocacy. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's campaign team worked around the clock not to capitalize on the moment, but to keep up with it. In just 48 hours, her congressional re-election campaign raised over $500,000 from small-dollar donors across all 50 states. The donations came with messages not just of support, but of identification. One note read, "You didn't just speak for your district. You spoke for everyone who's ever been told to sit down and listen when they had something important to say." Another simply read, "Thank you. I saw myself in your silence." The ripple effect extended beyond party lines. Conservative commentators who disagreed with Crockett's policy positions acknowledged her rhetorical discipline. Ben Shapiro posted, "While I strongly disagree with her conclusions, Crockett demonstrated the value of staying on message and delivering facts with precision. That's how you earn respect in debate." And that was the true legacy of the moment. Not policy wins, not applause lines, not a viral quote, but the restoration of respect as a metric in political conversation. Late-night television, of course, did what it always does. Satire writers and sketch shows recreated the scene not to mock, but to elevate. One SNL skit depicted a courtroom shrinking around Judge Judy as Crockett calmly laid out her case, symbolizing a generational shift, not in decorum, but in definition, what justice means, what accountability looks like, and who gets to speak on either. International media picked up the story as well. The BBC headlined it, "Calm Conquers U.S. Congresswoman Reframes the Debate on Justice." In France, Le Monde described it as a new voice in American politics, who leads with intellect, not indignation. From Seoul to São Paulo, the story of a rising political figure who never shouted but shifted a national conversation became an unlikely case study in effective communication. Inside Washington, the effects were tangible. Legislation tied to sentencing reform, long stalled in committee, began to see renewed discussion. Crockett was invited to closed-door meetings with senior leadership across party lines. Not to campaign, just to explain. And while Judge Judy did not issue a formal statement, her team quietly released a single sentence to the press. "Judge Shindlin respects Congresswoman Crockett's passion and thanks CNN for a robust conversation on the future of justice in America." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't needed. The silence had already said more. Weeks later, when asked about the exchange during a Sunday morning news panel, Crockett responded simply, "I didn't go in trying to win an argument. I went in trying to speak truth. And the truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it just waits until someone is ready to hear it." In an era defined by volume outrage and rapid-fire takedowns, Jasmine Crockett offered something rare, a blueprint for a different kind of leadership. Not reaction, response, not confrontation, clarity, and most of all, not the last word, but the right one. As the nation continued to dissect the moment, one fact became clear: Judge Judy had defined courtroom drama for decades, but Jasmine Crockett had just redefined what justice sounds like when it refuses to be drowned out. And in doing so, she didn't just shift a conversation, she shifted the culture.